It was early June 2017. I was taking a road trip with my 9-year-old son Tom to West Virginia to visit family. It was a long, stressful drive. My car didn't have working AC at the time, and it was an incredibly hot day, so we were a bit stressed out. By the 6-hour mark, we had left later in the day, so we were still on the road by dark. I think it was around 9 p.m. when we were still on the interstate, and Tom started complaining that he needed to use the bathroom. There was already tension in the car before this, but his constant complaining brought about a slight argument between the two of us. It was about personal stuff I'd rather not share with the internet. At last, I saw a blue rest area sign zoom past us on the interstate, so I veered off into the rest area. It had a small building with 2 bathrooms, a couple of vending machines, and a few benches. That was it. There were no other cars parked nearby besides some big white pickup truck. As I pulled up next to the building, Tom got out in a hurry and ran to the bathroom. I left the car on because I knew he'd be back soon. Like I said, I don't want to get into personal stuff like why we had a bit of an argument, but it seemed we were at that stage where we weren't exchanging words anymore. I figured the rest of the ride would be silent. About a minute later, the back door opened. I wanted to say something to Tom, but I didn't know what to say, so I just stayed quiet and drove off. I noticed that the white pickup truck parked nearby was leaving as well. In fact, he was close behind me. I veered back onto the interstate and into the left lane, and the pickup truck did the same. I stepped on it a little, and so did he. He started flashing his lights, so I switched to the right lane, thinking he was just an aggressive driver. But as soon as I switched to the right, so did he. He was still flashing his lights. I pulled into the right lane and started to slow down. He sped up, still in the middle lane, and when he caught up to me, he slowed down and lowered his window. I did the same, and he started yelling something to me, pointing at my car. He looked like a creepy, sketchy dude at first glance. I couldn't hear a word he was saying, so he pointed for me to pull over to the side. I told Tom to keep calm. In my head, I was saying if this guy tried to do anything funny, I would floor it. The pickup pulled up behind me on the grass, and the guy came out of his truck running to my car. I put the car back in drive as my heart was racing, ready to drive, but then he screamed. Wait, he got to my window and said, "That's not your kid," and pointed to the back seat. As he said this, I was confused and said what he said, "That's not your kid that got in your car." Suddenly, the back right side door opened, and I turned to see someone getting out of my car. It wasn't my son Tom. I got out from the car screaming at the tall person who seemed to be a fully grown man, but they had already disappeared into the woods. I looked at the driver of the pickup and thanked him as I suddenly panicked, thinking about what could have happened to Tom. I got back in my car, crossed the grass between the interstate, and drove back to the rest area. The guy in the pickup followed me. We got back there in like 30 seconds to find Tom waiting outside the rest area bathroom. He got back in the car, all confused. I explained everything to him almost out of breath, as did the pickup driver. I thanked the guy one more time before he drove back to the spot he was sitting in before. Tom was so intrigued about what just happened, and I was so disturbed that we were back on good terms again. We chatted the whole rest of the way and told family about it as soon as we arrived. I never even got to see what the person who got in my car looked like. Honestly, maybe I should be happy I never turned around to look at them because I don't know what they would have done. My girlfriend and I took a road trip to California recently. The way there was completely normal. We left home early in the morning and got to the hotel by nightfall. On our way back home, however, we left midday, and a majority of our ride was in the dark. The drive was about 10 hours each way, not including stops for food. We made 2 food stops, the first after about 3 hours of driving, then one more much later and deeper into the night. We got off the freeway at like 12:30 at night and went to the nearest Wendy's for food. We got right back on the freeway after that. I ate while I drove, which my girlfriend wasn't too fond of, but I just wanted to get home sooner rather than later. Shortly after getting back on the freeway, it started to rain. My girlfriend forced me to pull over. Now, she didn't want me eating and driving in poor conditions. As I pulled to the side, it actually started to downpour. I finished up eating my food, and then we heard a banging sound at the window. At first, I chalked it up to noises from the storm, but when I looked to my left out the window, I saw a figure blocking 90% of the window, along with the shriek of my girlfriend. I nearly had a heart attack. I didn't want to roll down the window given how hard it was pouring, but over the sound of the torrential rain pounding on the car, I couldn't hear what the person was saying. I opened the door a crack and yelled out to the person, who turned out to be a woman. She was soaked already and looked disheveled and scared. She asked for a ride. What was I going to do? Tell her no in these conditions? I told her to get in the back seat. My girlfriend gave me a look. I don't know what kind of look exactly, but it looked kind of like, why the hell did you let her in kind of look. I asked the woman where she was heading. She didn't answer. I caught my girlfriend giving me a look again because of this. I ignored her and turned around to look at the woman in the back seat, assuming she didn't hear me. But as creepy as it was, she was actually looking right at me with a cold, unfriendly face. I'd say it was a neutral, blank face, but something about it was just off-putting. I repeated my question, and she just shrugged her shoulders and laughed. I looked at my girlfriend, who was once again looking at me. I said out loud that I'd be dropping the woman off at the next town we crossed. I guess I was announcing that to both my girlfriend and the woman. As we got back onto the barren highway, there was a sudden, ear-piercing screaming sound coming from right behind me. The woman sitting behind me suddenly wrapped her arms around my throat. I slammed on the brakes as I was struggling to breathe, almost sliding into the divider. My girlfriend clawed at the woman's face with her long nails. The screaming turned from a deranged, angry kind of screaming to screams of pain and agony. I got out of the car as she had her hands pressed up against her face, nagging. Then I opened the back door, grabbed the woman with both hands, and literally threw her out of the car into the rain. She started begging, "Please, please," over and over as I looked down at her, but that's all she said. She cried as she kept saying the word please. I ignored her and got back into my car and locked it. As I put the car in drive, there were bangs at the window as the woman started screaming again. Her screams once again sounded like the screams of a deranged mental asylum patient. I drove away casually. She was no longer a real threat, or at least not that I knew of. My girlfriend quickly got on the phone with the police and warned them of some suspicious, unstable woman lurking around the highway. We didn't stop again, though. We went straight home from there, obviously a bit shaken up and whatnot, but I didn't want to be thinking about that incident for any longer than I had to. It was 2010. I was driving my Ford F-150 from my home in Pennsylvania to Georgia. I had family in the countryside of Georgia who I'd be spending the week with. It was going to be a drive of around 14 hours, and I planned on doing it all in one day. I got on the road at 10 a.m. I stopped once for lunch at some deli, and then 4 hours later I stopped at a rest area to eat the turkey sandwiches I packed in the cooler. After that, I didn't intend on making any other stops besides for gas one more time, of course. At about 11:30 p.m., I had just filled up the tank one more time, and now I had an ETA of about 12:30. I was admittedly getting very tired now. I didn't think to get coffee at the gas station for some reason. The route the GPS was taking me down from the gas station seemed a little odd. I wasn't on the highway anymore, it was just taking me down some country-ass side roads. My truck is high up, so I got a good view of everything, and I also had a light bar installed, which really helped in lighting up these pitch-black roads. I was so tired and I knew I shouldn't have been driving anymore, but I was so close to my cousin's house that I had to keep going. I came to a stop sign and made a left turn off some quiet road onto an even quieter road. The speed limit on this road was 45 though, which was good. This road was empty of any kinds of buildings or houses, it was just woodland on either side. I was going like 55 to 60 miles per hour, blazing down this road since it really seemed like no other cars would be on this type of road at this hour. Then suddenly I saw like 4 shiny objects coming up fast in the road ahead of me. I slammed on the brakes, and as I got closer I figured out what they were. They were traffic drums, like those big cylinder traffic cones. My truck managed to come to a halt before I rammed into the drums. I got out of my truck with my baseball bat, confused as hell, and went over to the traffic drums and realized there was something else behind the traffic drums. It was a spike trap like the kind police use. I didn't know what to think. Is there some kind of police activity going on, or did somebody set this up as a trap? I cautiously looked all around me as I inched back to my truck. Then I heard someone scream. Help, it came from the woods on the left side of the road. There was no way I was about to go into those woods. The most I was willing to do was call out, "What's wrong?" No answer. I walked to the edge of the road and looked into the forest. The only reason I could see anything was because of the lights from my truck. In the corner of my eye, I spotted him. Without looking directly at him, I saw someone crouched down behind a couple of bushes. I didn't run, I just casually walked back to my car. When I got in and shut the door, I looked to my left to see 2 silhouettes by the edge of the woods on the side of the road walking towards my truck. I drove the truck to the right side of the road, onto the dirt, and past the spike trap. I don't think they anticipated me actually going around, but when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw at least 3 silhouettes standing by the traffic drums, lit up only briefly by the taillights of my truck. A few seconds later, they were gone, out of my vision, and out of my life forever. This was not something I would have ever expected to happen to me. Nevertheless, I'm glad I made it out alive. Two summers ago, on my way home from an out-of-town day trip for my son's birthday party, we went to a water park and decided to have dinner in a really small town. After getting slightly lost due to Google Maps' crappy directions, we stumbled upon a county fair across the street. It was getting dark and the fair was nearly over, but we caught a tractor pull about to begin. We'd never been to one, so we thought it might be a fun way to top off the birthday trip. We sat on the bleachers and watched for a while. Many families were there, but also some drunk people. I didn't think anything of it. I had my 16-year-old son and a good friend with me, so I felt safe. Deciding to leave before the event ended, we walked back to the closed-room restaurant, got into my car, and set off for home, backtracking using Google Maps. We took a road I recognized that would get us back home. I noticed a car behind me as soon as we pulled out of the restaurant. It was the only other car on the road, as most town inhabitants were likely at the fair or at home. The car followed us onto the road, which I found odd because it was a desolate, hilly road with wooded areas on either side. I thought maybe they were from out of town too, and were using the same cut across to get to the interstate, as it was summer and many people road trip. I still felt uneasy but decided to get off this back road and onto the interstate as soon as possible. Driving on this hilly back road, it was fully dark outside, and I kept it easy for fear of a deer running out in front of us. The car stayed right behind me. I slowed way down, hoping he would pass me for going too slow. Instead, he drove right up on my tail, tailgating me. I could see that it was only one person in the car, and the windows were tinted. I dared to speed up, wanting to get on a main road or interstate as soon as I could. He stayed right behind me, going as fast or slow as I was, not bothering to get off my bumper. I knew we were being harassed now. I was scared. I had my son in the back seat on his birthday. It was unfair, and I kicked myself for going to the tractor pull. Of course, I could not have predicted this craziness. After what seemed like ages, we got onto the interstate. I hoped it was just some local jerk who wanted to scare some city folks, but I somehow knew it was not that simple. As I feared, he followed us onto the interstate. Even on the interstate, he tailgated us. I slowed down initially, hoping he'd pass us, but no luck. I sped way up, but he caught up and stayed too close. Unfortunately, the interstate was quiet on our side. I had no choice but to keep going. My friend was angry and ready to fight if necessary, but I wanted no part of meeting this guy face to face, especially with my birthday boy in the back seat. I just kept going and prayed not to get a flat tire. At one point, I got scared enough to lay on the horn while driving, hoping the noise would dissuade him. It worked. He pulled over on the shoulder, and I saw his headlights turn off. I was relieved at first, but we found it odd that he killed the lights. After that, we sped up, and I was flying for home. About 15 minutes passed in blissful uneventfulness. We talked about how scary that whole ordeal was, and eventually started feeling relieved to put it all behind us. We were about 25 minutes from home, and there were a couple of vehicles here and there which made us feel less alone on the road. At one point, when the cars thinned out and we were once again alone on the road, something happened that I could not believe. Right next to us and slightly behind us, headlights burst on. He had been following us that whole time with his lights off, staying carefully behind us and waiting for his chance to scare and surprise us. I almost started crying, but at this point I was too angry. This guy had been following us for an hour now. Far ahead of us, I saw the taillights of a semi. I sped up quickly with the stranger in the car next to me trying to pace us from the fast lane. I think he realized that I was trying to catch up with the semi, so for the first time in this insane chase, he did something truly dangerous and swerved at my rear panel, a pit maneuver trying to push us off the road. I sped ahead and missed him, clipping me by inches. I finally reached the semi-driver and got close, hugging the back of his truck as much as I dared and leaving no room for this jerk to cut me off. We went this way for a little while. Finally, and I truly believe, this semi-driver knew something was wrong, because after so long of seeing this crazy driver swerving at me and trying to get in front of me, the semi-driver did something I will forever appreciate him for. He swerved over into the fast lane and dangerously cut off the stranger's car and then tapped his brakes. I took it as my cue to speed ahead from the slow lane and try to lose this creep. I sped up to about 90. My hometown was straight ahead. I took a sharp left onto a back street that led to a main road and stopped in a busy, well-lit gas station. Luckily, there was a cop there. My friend got out and explained the whole situation to the officer, and he called for other cars to search for this guy. We left the gas station after calling a friend to follow me to a parking lot where I stowed my car overnight, because I did not want the guy to possibly find my house by recognizing the car. I watched my back for quite some time after that. I always notice that make and model of car in white if I see one on the streets. Thank goodness we got away safely. Now, the most bothersome thing about this story is that the small town where this took place happens to be the hometown of one of the biggest mental health asylums in the Midwest. This thought has kept me awake more than one night. and I still check the papers for stories of escapees. This happened around 15 years ago, and to this day, whenever I think about what happened, a cold shiver runs down my spine. Myself, my cousins, and my brother are damn lucky. My parents own a timeshare in Laguna Beach, and it's a good 5 to 6 hour drive from where my family lives outside Las Vegas. My cousin and her boyfriend at the time were visiting from Philly, and they, along with my aunt and grandma, were accompanying my family mom, dad, and brother to California. My parents, aunt, and grandma were in one car, and they had gotten a bit of a head start as my dad's anal about leaving right on time. However, US kids, I was 25 and the oldest, so not really a kid, but you get the point, we're about an hour behind them due to my brother being a slowpoke. Anyway, my cousin's boyfriend was driving and my brother was in the passenger seat. My cousin and I were behind them, chit-chatting. It was around 4 p.m. and we were somewhere outside Nipton, California. Now, for those of you who have gone through Nipton before, you know the place is creepy as heck. There's a general store with an outhouse bathroom and, I believe, a restaurant. Anyway, we were maybe 10 minutes from Nipton when we saw a car pulled off into the desert. We drove by and my brother goes, "There's a guy lying in the desert." We go back and forth about calling 911 when we realize none of us have any bars. This was before smartphones blew up. I was able to get service if I held up my phone slightly. We figured we'd turn back just to suss out the situation. We turned back, and my brother and my cousin's boyfriend got out and started hollering at the guy, asking if he was okay. No answer. Just as they decided to step closer to see if this guy was dead, my cousin and I spotted two people hiding behind the car's trunk. We screamed for my brother and her boyfriend, and I think they had heard rustling, so they sprinted back and piled into the car. Meanwhile, the guy who was supposedly injured sat up, and two scary-looking dudes popped up. My cousin's boyfriend took off. We were all freaking out. Meanwhile, I had bars and called 911 to report what happened. We pulled into Nipton while I talked to a dispatcher who took my info and said she'd send someone out there. I'd like to say that's the end of my story and we made our way to the beach, but no, it's not. Because we continued on to Baker and decided we were safe enough to pull into the Mad Greek for a bathroom break and some strawberry shakes and gyros. We were waiting for our order when my cousin's boyfriend came over to the table looking like he saw a ghost. He pointed outside across from the Mad Greek at the little trading post. There we had parked our car. Guess who pulls in 3 cars down? Yeah, if you guessed the 3 rough-looking dudes, you'd be right. They got out and looked around and walked into the post. Meanwhile, we were getting our food to go and devising a way to get the heck out of town, as we were being stared down by these freaks. We told the employees of the Mad Greek what had happened, and the girl at the counter locked the door. She called the police while we went out a back entrance and snuck into our car, leaving the food behind. They were headed back to their car as we sped off, but we managed to lose them. A few days later, I called the police in Nipton, who confirmed that 2 of the 3 men were caught and arrested for attempting to hijack a car. When I was younger, probably around 17 or 18, I was driving back from my boyfriend's house late at night. It was a 45-minute drive through mostly country roads, and I always took the same route. One night I was driving home and decided to take a different route for no particular reason. I had never been on this road before and didn't realize how secluded it was. There were no street lights, and the road was surrounded by thick woods. After driving for a while, my car suddenly broke down. I tried to start it again, but it wouldn't budge. I was in the middle of nowhere with no cell service. I sat in my car for a while, hoping another car would come by, but no one did. After what felt like hours, I decided to walk. I didn't know where I was going, but I figured I had to find a house or a gas station eventually. I walked for what felt like miles until I saw a faint light in the distance. As I got closer, I realized it was a house. I walked up to the front door and knocked. An older man answered and looked at me with confusion. I explained my situation, and he invited me in. He let me use his phone to call my parents, who were worried sick. They called a tow truck, and the man let me wait in his living room until it arrived. He was very kind and offered me something to eat and drink. The tow truck eventually came and I was able to get home safely. But to this day, I still think about what could have happened if I hadn't found that house. Get ready for this gut-wrenching horror story. This one will make you reconsider your behavior around scary people. A few years ago, when I was in college, I had an apartment to myself. When I graduated, I decided to move since I'd be making enough money to afford a better place and wanted to find something closer to work. Like many people, I had accumulated a lot of stuff while living there, so I decided to sell things before I left. My apartment was on the second floor of a small older building, right next to the school. I posted an ad on Craigslist titled "Moving Sale" and listed the individual items in the body of the ad. I didn't have anything really valuable, just some furniture, books, and my computer monitor, which I wanted to replace with a bigger one now that I could afford it. Messages started coming in right away since it was the end of the school year, and many students were getting ready to move off campus. I set up a constant stream of buyers coming and going from my place. Most of the furniture was sold quickly, and it seemed like everything would be gone in no time. One Saturday, I set aside the whole day to move as much of my unwanted stuff as I could. 5 or 6 different people had come by already, all of which were students. Then I got a message from a guy named Larry. Larry said he was interested in my desk and chair. I didn't give it a second thought and invited him to come over and take a look. We agreed on a time, and when it was close, I went down to the street and waited for him. After waiting for a few minutes, I saw an older van pull up on the street. It was light brown in color, had some noticeable dents, and dark tinted windows. If it was late at night, I would have been seriously creeped out by it. I didn't think it was him at first, but when the van parked, 2 men got out and walked up to me. One of them introduced himself as Larry. They were both older guys, probably in their mid-50s if I had to guess. Larry was thin and of average height with dark black hair that I think was dyed. The other guy was taller and on the heavier side. He was bald and wore a dirty white t-shirt. I felt uneasy but didn't want to be judgmental, so I invited the men to take a look at the desk. I went first, and the 2 men followed me into the building. I unlocked my front door and held it open for them. Once we were inside, I walked over to the desk expecting both men to follow me, but that didn't happen. Only Larry followed me. The bigger man stood next to the door. I looked back at him, and when I did, he looked angry, kind of like a bouncer at a nightclub or something. It was quite intimidating. Nevertheless, I continued to show the desk to Larry. He walked around it, inspecting it for a few seconds, and I stood there awkwardly. The tension was building. Eventually I said, "Well, do you like it?" Larry stopped and gave me a stern look. Then he looked over to his friend by the door. My eyes followed. We both looked at the big man standing there with his arms crossed when he nodded. When I looked back over to Larry, he was holding a large knife and pointing it at me. I panicked at the sight of the knife and tried to run, not realizing that there was nowhere to go. Moments later, the big man grabbed me, pressed my whole body against the wall, and pulled my arms behind my back, holding me there while Larry ransacked my apartment. He took everything of value that I had: my laptop, my phone, my camera. I do photography as a hobby and had a $2,000 camera at the time, and the money from the other items I'd sold that day. After 5 minutes, they let me go and booked it out of there. I sat on my floor, stunned, for a few minutes. Then I got up and knocked on my neighbor's door to call the police. They arrived within a few minutes, and I filed a report. I gave them a description, but it must not have been enough to catch those guys. I never got the license plate number, and obviously the email he used was a throwaway. It was several months before I had a decent night's sleep. The difficult part wasn't losing my stuff, to be honest. I hardly even cared about that. I'd always been a really trusting person before, but with this life-altering experience, it has caused me to reconsider a lot of things, mostly my perspective on people. For this next creepy horror story, sometimes you leave, and you don't even realize how lucky you were to walk away with your life. I was 23 when this happened. At this point in my life, I was living in Edmonton and had just left a toxic job. I was living out of a hotel because my apartment had water damage from a burst pipe, and we were evacuated. I spent my downtime in hotel rooms searching online for a new position. I was somewhat desperate since I quit my last job before finding a new one. A big mistake. I was at the point where I would basically take anything to get by until I found a job I really wanted. I applied to various positions on Craigslist, including a company's recruiting receptionist, but wasn't having much luck. Finally, I received a call from a man who owned a small engine repair shop. He needed an assistant to help organize the front end and answer phones. It was something I wouldn't normally do. I typically work in healthcare, but as I said, desperate times, and how bad could it be? I agreed to meet him that day at a restaurant for drinks, which I thought was somewhat unusual. When I was getting ready to leave, he texted me saying that we should meet at his shop instead. I thought that would be more appropriate. When I arrived at the shop and walked in the door, I was slightly disgusted. The shop was tiny and absolutely filthy. Papers were strewn all over the floor, and they were covered with dirt. There were food and beer bottles all around. It was in bad shape. I felt uncomfortable and majorly overdressed. I wore a nice business dress with cute heels and simple jewelry. I was greeted by a man whose appearance was very similar to that of his shop. He was wearing a dirty, torn-up shirt, a gold chain, and was covered with tattoos. He had a beer in one hand and reached for my hand with the other to introduce himself. He finished his beer, ran back to the fridge behind the desk, and pulled out 2 more. "Want one?" he asked. I respectfully declined. In the back of my mind, I knew it wasn't a good idea. I know some of you are thinking that was a red flag, but in Alberta, people drink a lot. I'm not saying it's necessarily normal to drink on the job, but in this line of work, it may be more common, so I didn't think much of it. Also, I had been around my share of sketchy people, so it took a lot to make me feel uneasy. It may be fair to say that I was naive, even though I've been through a few things myself. He then started talking about what he would need from me as an assistant. Then, for the rest of our 2-hour interview, he spoke about himself. I'll give you a brief summary of the topics we discussed. He talked about how hungover he was, and all the drugs he did the night before. Then he complained about his girlfriend for a while and told me that he liked my blue eyes. He mentioned that he kind of wanted to hire me but felt I was too stuck up. By this point, I was starting to become aware of the situation I was in. I was feeling very uneasy, not to mention the way he looked at me the whole time was very unnerving as well. I know most people would have left by this point, but I'm painfully polite and hate being rude, even when it's warranted. I made sure to inform him that I was meeting my boyfriend right after the interview. Then he asked to give me a tour of the shop in the back, and that was scary. We were the only ones in there, and this guy was definitely a sketchy dude. He was also at least twice my size. I told him it was getting late and I needed to go, but thanked him for his time. He said he would contact me soon because he may need me as early as next week to begin work. He seemed annoyed that I was leaving, but I had been there for 2 hours, so I booked it out of there. A couple of weeks later, I was still jobless. I was searching online for jobs when I came across an ad with the title, "Ladies, Beware Small Engine Repair Shop Hiring Assistant." I immediately noticed that it was the one I had interviewed for, so I clicked the link. In the post, it mentioned that the man was currently under investigation for inappropriate behavior with 2 women who answered his ad. The article said that they went into his shop and he drugged their drinks. All I could think about was how lucky I was not to drink that beer he offered me. I was contacted by a lady and her daughter who had had a similar experience with that man in the shop. She gave me one of the Edmonton constable's numbers. I did contact them and left a message, but they never got back to me. It turns out that they had been watching that guy for a while, and he still has charges dating back to 1991. I narrowly missed that bullet. Lesson here: always let people know where you are and never take drinks from strangers. Remember, just because the lights are on doesn't mean someone is there. This creepy story began as my son was younger. He went through a growth spurt and outgrew his bicycle. My husband and I only had one child, so everything we bought for him could only be used once. Therefore, it did get pretty costly to buy things only for him to outgrow them within a year, sometimes even less. Because of that, we often used Craigslist to get some of those temporary possessions that would only last for a little while anyway. We used it extensively for baby clothes and accessories when he was really young, so it was a clear choice for a new bike when he grew out of his old one. I spent some time browsing the ads one evening. There were a few nice-looking ones, but they were all overpriced. Some people have the crazy idea that they can sell things for pretty much the original price online. When I buy things used, I pretty much expect to pay half the original price otherwise. What's the point? I kept scrolling and eventually found a red mountain bike that was roughly the right size. It was actually a little too big, but I figured my son could grow into it. The price was right as well. The seller only wanted $100, which was well under half the original price when I looked it up. I sent a message to the seller and got a reply in less than an hour. The seller said her name was Shelley, and we arranged a time to pick up the bike, and she told me the address. The house was in the next town over, and it was about a 45-minute drive for me. I set off when the time came. I went alone, even though I realized that I should have taken my husband. The sun was setting as I drove there. The neighborhood was older, some of the houses had boarded up windows, and the streets were almost empty. It was an eerie feeling because my neighborhood is very vibrant and friendly. The place seemed like a ghost town. When I got to Shelley's house, it looked like many of the other ones on the street. It was in disrepair, but I could see a pickup truck in the driveway. It settled my nerves slightly because I knew someone was there. I parked my car on the street in front of the house and walked up to the front door. I pressed the doorbell, but it didn't seem to work. I tried it again and pressed my ear up to the door. It was definitely broken. Not surprising considering the condition of the place. It was beyond rundown. It looked even worse close up. I was about to leave when suddenly the door opened. An older man stood in the doorway with a friendly smile. He introduced himself as Shelley's husband. He was tall but didn't look intimidating. He had a cane in his right hand, presumably because he had trouble walking. The man told me the bike was out in the shed at the back and he told me to meet him there. I know I sound really naive right now, but the man was really quite charming, and I trusted him. I walked around the house, and the man was waiting for me in the backyard. We walked together towards the small shed that was on the far end of his property, which was surrounded by a tall wooden fence. When we got close, I saw something move in the shed. Someone was in there. I could see it through the dirty window next to the door. I was panicking inside, but I didn't want to show it. I stopped walking and looked behind me. That's when I saw two more men standing in the yard blocking my path back to my car. I was surrounded. He led me into a trap. My fight or flight kicked in. I chose flight, so I took off running. I didn't even know where to go, but once I reached the fence, I climbed over it and kept running. I soon found myself in the woods. I just kept going and never looked back. After what felt like a really long time, I stopped to catch my breath. Eventually, I made it back to the road and called the police. We went back to the house together, and it's no surprise that the men were gone. I told the police what happened, but the men were never caught, and I later found out that the house was abandoned. I don't even want to think about what those men had planned. The best case scenario was that they were going to rob me, but if that was their plan, then they knew I likely only had the $100 for the bike. It doesn't seem like it would have been worth it, and my gut feeling told me they had more sinister plans. You can't fake a Polaroid. In this mind-blowing true horror story, pictures are worth more than any amount of money because it could mean your life. Let's begin. I live in a large city, but my parents live in a smaller town about 2 hours away from me. My mom retired recently, and she's always been good at keeping busy. She's been using Craigslist to declutter her house from all the junk that my brother and I accumulated over the years. Every now and then she gives me a few bucks for things that she sold that were apparently mine. She's always been very generous. I honestly wouldn't mind if she just kept it all, but it's always a nice surprise whenever it happens. Another thing that she likes to do on Craigslist is trade books. She was a school librarian, so she really likes vintage copies of classic literature. Finding something special or rare online is like a game for her. That's where I come in. Since I was in the city, some of the good deals that she found would be close to me. She'd often ask me to make trades for her, and then I would give them to her whenever we would see each other next. One day I got a call from my mom. She told me that she was talking to someone from Craigslist who had an old copy of The Great Gatsby, one of her favorites. She had agreed to trade for some books that I still had at my place from a previous trade. She set up the meeting just down the street from my apartment. It was no problem for me, so I told her I would get the book and save it for the next time she came to visit. I left my apartment and walked down the street to the corner where she told me to go. When I got close, I saw a young guy standing there holding a small book. That must be him, I thought. He was a younger guy, probably my age, if not a few years younger. He was tall and thin with long hair, looking like he belonged in a heavy metal band or something. Not exactly what I was expecting for someone dealing in vintage books, but who am I to judge? I walked up and introduced myself. We shook hands, and he told me his name was Brett. Then we made the trade. After that, we went our separate ways. I didn't think much of it, and then I went back home. When I walked into my apartment, I threw the book onto my desk and forgot about it for a few days. When the weekend came, I decided to take a look at the book. I had never read it, but I'd seen the movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, so I decided to give it a chance. I picked it up and flipped through the pages, and then something fell out. It looked like one of those old Polaroid photographs. I had never seen one in person, I only recognized it from watching old movies. It landed on the ground face down, and when I picked it up, I almost lost my lunch. It was hard to be sure, but it looked like a picture of a dead body. There was a man lying on the floor of what seemed like a hotel or a motel room, and he was covered in blood. I thought it was some kind of sick joke at first. I thought it was a prop for a show or something. Maybe that guy Brett was making a horror movie. That's what I thought at the time anyway. I thought about it for a minute or two, and I decided that I needed to call the police. It's better to report it and find out that it's fake rather than ignore it, and it turns out to be real. I called 911 and told the operator what happened. He seemed to take it seriously and sent an officer to me. I went to the station and filed a report. We got my mom on the phone to see if she could track down Brett. She had only communicated with him through email, and he wasn't replying. The officers were not able to tell for sure if the picture was real, but they promised to do more analysis on it. It's been just over 2 months, and I still haven't heard anything back from the police. I still don't know if the picture was real. This was one of the creepiest things that's ever happened to me. Was I just face to face with a murderer? If so, why would he put that picture in there? An accident, maybe? Or maybe he was toying with me like it was some kind of sick game to show someone what he had done. This terrifying tale all begins when independence looks so good, but reality bites much harder. My name is Maya. I'm 25 years old living in the city with my boyfriend Kevin. Honestly, things have been tough lately. Kevin lost his job a few months ago, and money has been really tight. We had been staying with my parents for a while to get back on our feet, but you know how it is living with parents as an adult. It just starts to weigh on you after a while. You feel like you've lost your independence. Kevin was going stir crazy just sitting around the house all day. Actually, we both were. So when we saw this suspiciously cheap apartment listing on Craigslist, it seemed too good to be true. But Kevin was desperate to get us out of my parents' place. I'll admit, I kind of love the idea of having our own little nest again, a fresh start. Despite the little voice of doubt in the back of my mind, we took it. In hindsight, I should have listened to that voice. It all started out pretty mundane and normal at first. The apartment was nothing fancy, just a basic one-bedroom in an older building on the rougher side of town, but it was clean. The landlord seemed nice enough. And hey, we could actually afford it. Those first few days we were just relieved to be out on our own again. We went to the grocery store, cooked dinners together, and binge-watched some shows on Netflix in the evenings. All that simple blessing of normalcy we had been craving finally came to fruition. Then the petty disagreements about leaving dishes in the sink, or whose turn it was to take out the trash, began. I missed those silly arguments when things started to go wrong. But then all the hair-raising events began around the 4th or 5th night. I woke up sometime after 11 p.m. to use the bathroom. As I was coming out, I heard the most terrifying sound of a woman screaming. No, screaming doesn't even describe it properly. It was this blood-curdling, ripping shriek of pure fear and agony. It made my blood run cold. I shook Kevin awake in a panic. "Did you hear that? Someone's in trouble? We have to call the police," I said. He tried to calm me down, saying it was probably just a TV or something from another apartment. But I knew what I heard. It wasn't normal. Right then there was frantic knocking at our door, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. Kevin motioned for me to stay back as he carefully went over and opened it a crack. It was our landlord, Mr. Carl. He had this disturbingly casual smile on his face as he said, "No need for alarm, folks. Just a little disagreement between a couple of tenants. But it's being taken care of, so no need to call the authorities, okay?" The way he said it with such a total lack of concern was so bizarrely off-putting, almost like he was amused by the whole thing. I shivered despite the warm night. "If you're sure, Mr. Carl," Kevin said uneasily. "We'd still hate to be a bother. Can we call if anything else comes up?" "Oh, there's no bother at all. But please, if you do happen to see or hear anything unsettling, don't go calling the cops, please. That never ends well for anyone, Mr." Carl chuckled as if he just told a hilarious joke. "You two seem like such a nice, smart young couple. Why don't you just give me a ring directly if any future unpleasantness arises? I'll get it sorted out." He gave an overconfident wink, then without another word turned and headed back down the dingy hallway whistling some eerily cheery tune. The look Kevin and I exchanged in the wake of that supremely unsettling encounter said it all. We both knew deep down that something was deeply wrong here with Kozak, with this whole place. But what choice did we have? We were broke and hadn't even unpacked all our things yet, so we tried our best to just ignore it. Chalk it up to the landlord being some eccentric old man and hope things didn't get any weirder. Oh, how I wish I could go back to the naive mindset of those first few nights, unburdened by the sickening realizations that were still to come. It started with the small things at first, like hearing strange noises in the night. Not just screams this time, but occasional muffled thumps and the sounds of people frantically running up and down the halls, always at the most unholy hours between midnight and 4 a.m. Whenever I brought it up to Kevin, he got this glazed, half-asleep look in his eyes and denied hearing anything out of the ordinary. Part of me wondered if he was just trying to reassure me to cling to some sense of normalcy in our new home. Another part of me knew he heard those noises too, and was just as terrified as I was. Then more bizarre events started occurring. Strangers would randomly knock at our door at all hours, just dazed-looking men reeking of booze or worse. Me, Carl said it would be okay. This is where I'm supposed to go. We stuck to the cardinal rule of never opening the door to those sketchy individuals. But the implications of what they were showing up for made my blood run cold. Kevin and I didn't even want to voice our darkest suspicions out loud. Despite the escalating weirdness, we both felt so trapped. Neither of us had jobs at that point, and we had blown what little savings we had on the move and security deposit. Where the hell else could we go? Then came the night that fully shattered any remaining illusions. The night that pushed us past the breaking point. I woke up around 2 a.m. to Kevin tossing and turning, mumbling incoherently in his sleep. I tried to gently shake him awake, growing more frantic as he wouldn't wake up. Finally, his eyes flashed open, wild and unfocused. He looked right through me with zero recognition. "Kevin, babe, what's wrong? You were having a nightmare." That's when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a young woman crying, sobbing in pure, hopeless despair. It seemed to be coming from the apartment next door. My heart stopped as I realized whatever nightmare had been plaguing Kevin, he likely heard those cries too. We had the same horrific implications about what they meant. I wanted so badly to run out of there, pound on that door, but I'd seen enough crime documentaries to know that's exactly how young women end up dead. So we just sat there petrified, listening to those tormented wails that went on forever. Eventually they trailed off into a deathly silence, even more chilling. I knew deep down we couldn't spend another night in this waking nightmare. Not after that. The next morning we packed up as quickly and quietly as humanly possible. I didn't even care about getting the security deposit back at that point. Nothing was worth sticking around that hellhole a second longer. As we were dragging our meager belongings out to the cab, Mr. Carl emerged from the shadows and flashed that same sickening grin. "Leaving so soon?" "I do hope every accommodation was to your liking during your stay," he said, letting out this wheezy chuckle that made my skin crawl. Kevin urged me past without a word or eye contact. We never looked back. So there you have it. We got out, but so many mysteries remain. Just what kind of unspeakable depravities were happening behind those paper-thin walls? Who were those poor souls we heard screaming and crying out so desperately? And most of all, what did Mr. Carl mean by accommodation? Was he implying we were somehow complicit by our silence? By witnessing those horrors and doing nothing? I try not to dwell on it, but those questions still haunt me. If only we'd had the resources to go somewhere else right away. If only we'd found the courage to report Kozak no matter how ominous his warnings. If only in the end, I suppose we'll never know the full truth. But one thing's for certain from now on. We're never taking too good to be true apartment listings on Craigslist ever again. Some horrors are better left undiscovered.